The letters begin. There is a letter in the archives of the San Francisco Chronicle. It arrived at the newspaper's offices on August 1, 1969, in an ordinary envelope, addressed in block capitals. Inside were two items, a handwritten letter and a piece of paper covered in symbols, letters, numbers, and strange geometric forms arranged in rows, with no obvious meaning. The letter itself was not ordinary. It began, "This is the Zodiac speaking." The writer claimed responsibility for 3 recent murders in Northern California. He provided details that had not been made public, details that investigators would confirm were accurate. He threatened to kill more people if the letter was not printed on the front page of the newspaper. He said the cipher would, when decoded, reveal his identity. The Chronicle printed the letter. The cipher was not immediately decoded. The identity was not revealed. Over the following months and years, more letters would come. More ciphers. More threats. More details that were sometimes accurate and sometimes fantastical, delivered in a voice that was by turns boastful and playful and terrifying, the voice of someone who understood that the act of communication was itself a form of power, that writing to the newspapers was a way of controlling the story, of being present in the world in a way that went beyond the crimes themselves. The last confirmed letter from the Zodiac arrived in 1974. After that, silence. The case was never solved. The identity was never established. Tonight, I want to take you through the letters and the crimes and the investigations, through everything that was known and everything that was not. And at the end, I want to sit with the particular quality of the Zodiac's silence, the silence of someone who chose to stop, or who was stopped by causes we don't know, or who is still out there somewhere, and who has simply never been found. Let's begin. The crimes that would eventually be attributed to the Zodiac began not with a letter but with a murder, on a cold night in December 1968, in a rural area outside the small city of Vallejo, California. David Faraday was 17 years old. Betty Lou Jensen was 16. They were on their first date, parked on a remote road called Lake Herman Road, east of Vallejo, when someone approached their car and shot them. Faraday was killed outside the car. Jensen was found a short distance away, shot multiple times in the back, apparently while trying to run. The murders attracted immediate attention from the Solano County Sheriff's Office. The victims were young, the location was isolated, and there was no obvious motive, no robbery, no apparent prior connection between the victims and any suspect. But the investigation produced no arrests, and the case remained open. 7 months later, the killer struck again. On the night of July 4, 1969, Michael Mago and Dolene Ferrin were parked in a parking lot in Vallejo when an unknown man approached their car and shot them. Ferrin died. Mago survived, severely wounded, and was able to provide a description of the attacker, a stocky, heavy-set white male, medium height, with light brown or blonde hair. Within an hour of the shooting, a man called the Vallejo Police Department from a payphone and claimed responsibility for both the July 4 shooting and the Lake Herman Road murders the previous December. The call was brief, the voice calm. He gave specific details about the murders that confirmed he was telling the truth. Then he hung up. On August 1, 1969, for weeks after the Vallejo shooting, 3 letters arrived simultaneously at 3 Bay Area newspapers, the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each letter was identical in content but slightly different in presentation. Each claimed responsibility for the 2 Vallejo shootings and the Lake Herman Road murders. Each contained 1/3 of a 408-symbol cipher, with the instruction that the 3 cipher sections, when combined, would reveal the killer's identity. Each letter demanded that its contents be printed on the front page of the respective newspaper, under threat of further killings. The newspapers complied. The combined cipher was published. Amateur code breakers across the country began working on it immediately. Within a week, the 408 cipher had been solved, not by professional cryptographers but by a high school teacher named Donald Harden and his wife Betty, working at their kitchen table. The cipher, once decoded, revealed a chilling message about the killer's motivations, a message that invoked hunting humans as a form of collecting slaves for the afterlife, but revealed nothing about the killer's identity. The claim that the cipher would reveal who he was had been a lie, or a taunt. 8 days later, another letter arrived at the Chronicle. This letter began with the words that would become the killer's signature, "This is the Zodiac speaking." On September 27, 1969, the Zodiac attacked 2 college students, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, at Lake Berryessa, a reservoir in Napa County. This attack was different from the previous ones in several ways. The attacker wore a hood, a distinctive black bib hood with a white circle and cross symbol on the chest, a symbol that would become associated with the Zodiac's self-presentation. He bound his victims with pre-cut lengths of rope that he had brought with him, suggesting premeditation. He stabbed rather than shot them, a different method from the previous attacks, suggesting either experimentation or adaptation. Cecilia Shepard died from her wounds. Brian Hartnell survived and was able to provide a detailed account of the attack and a description of the attacker that was consistent with the earlier Vallejo description, a heavy-set white male, medium height. Hartnell noted that the attacker had spoken calmly throughout the attack, almost conversationally, as if the violence were simply a matter of routine. After the attack, the Zodiac called the Napa County Sheriff's Office from a payphone and reported the crime himself. He left his symbol drawn on Hartnell's car door, with the dates and methods of the 3 attacks he was claiming responsibility for. 2 weeks later, he killed again. On the night of October 11, 1969, a San Francisco cab driver named Paul Stine was shot and killed in the Presidio Heights neighborhood of San Francisco. This murder was witnessed, partially, by a group of teenagers who were looking out their window at the sound of a gunshot. They called the police. When officers arrived, they encountered a man on foot nearby, but a dispatcher had incorrectly described the suspect as a black male, and the officers let the white man they encountered pass. By the time the error was corrected, the killer was gone. The witness descriptions of the man seen near the cab were consistent with the earlier descriptions from Vallejo and Lake Berryessa, a heavy-set white male, early to mid-30s, with reddish-brown hair. The witnesses were close enough to the event that their descriptions were considered reliable. Days later, a letter arrived at the Chronicle. It contained a piece of Paul Stine's shirt, a detail that proved the writer had been present at the killing. The letter taunted the police for letting him walk past them on the night of the murder. It included a threat to attack a school bus. The threat against school children caused panic. Police presence was increased around Bay Area schools. Children were warned. Parents were frightened. The Zodiac did not attack any school bus. The murders and the letters generated an enormous law enforcement response. The San Francisco Police Department, the Napa County Sheriff's Office, the Solano County Sheriff's Office, and the Vallejo Police Department were all investigating cases that appeared to be connected. In November 1969, the SFPD established a task force specifically dedicated to the Zodiac investigation. The FBI was consulted. The full resources of California law enforcement were mobilized. The investigation produced a great deal of material, witness statements, physical evidence, handwriting analysis, forensic examination of the letters, but very few leads that advance toward identification. The handwriting analysis suggested an adult male with average or above-average education. The style of the letters, the word choices, the sentence construction, the deliberate misspellings that appeared in some letters, was analyzed by linguists and psychologists who produced profiles of the writer. The physical evidence from the crime scenes was limited: a partial palm print, a shoe print, the rope used at Lake Berryessa. None of this produced a name. None of this produced an arrest. The investigation was, by any standard, one of the largest and most sustained in California history. It was also, ultimately, unsuccessful. Through 1969 and into the early 1970s, letters continued to arrive at Bay Area newspapers and at the San Francisco Police Department. The letters varied considerably in their content and tone. Some were threatening, claiming that more killings were imminent. Some were taunting, mocking the police for their failure to catch him. Some were almost playful. The letter sent with pieces of Paul Stein's shirt included a Halloween card with a poem. One letter included a complicated cipher, never solved, that the Zodiac claimed would identify him if decoded. The letters also contained claims about the number of people the Zodiac had killed. In his early letters, he claimed 5 victims, those that investigators could confirm. In later letters, the count escalated: 7, then 13, then 37. Investigators were never able to attribute more than 5 confirmed murders to the Zodiac, though some researchers have proposed additional victims. Whether the inflated body count was an accurate tally of additional unconfirmed murders, a deliberate lie to inflate his reputation, or a fantasy that the Zodiac was indulging in the letters, is one of the many questions that the case leaves permanently open. What is certain is that the letters stopped being confirmed as genuine after 1974. The last letter accepted by investigators as likely authentic arrived at the Chronicle in January of that year. After that, several letters claimed to be from the Zodiac, but investigators found them unconvincing. The Zodiac, as far as the record shows, went silent. The letters are in the archives. The ciphers are partly solved and partly not. The crimes are documented. The victims are known. The killer is not. In Part 2, we go into the ciphers themselves, into the codes that the Zodiac created and the long, strange history of attempts to solve them. Rest here. Let the letters settle. Somewhere in the archives of the San Francisco Chronicle, the letters wait. They have been waiting for 50 years. The ciphers. The Zodiac created for ciphers. They are known, by convention, as Z for 08, Z340, Z13, and Z32, named for the number of characters each contains. Together, they represent one of the most famous unsolved cryptographic challenges in the history of American crime, and one of the most studied collections of encrypted text ever produced by a private individual. The ciphers are not equally complex. Z for 08, the first and longest, was solved within a week of its publication by an amateur codebreaker and his wife working at their kitchen table. Z340, the second and most discussed, resisted solution for 51 years until a team of 3 amateur cryptographers cracked it in December 2020. Z13 and Z32, the 2 shortest, remain unsolved, and may be insoluble with the information currently available. The ciphers are interesting not just as puzzles but as objects. They are handwritten, in block capitals, on ordinary paper. They combine letters, numbers, and invented symbols in arrangements that suggest someone who had thought carefully about cryptography, who understood the basic principles of code making and had made deliberate choices about how to construct messages that would resist casual decryption. Whether the Zodiac was a sophisticated cryptographer or a moderately informed amateur is one of the questions that the ciphers raise. The answer has implications for understanding who he was. The Zipher 08 cipher was sent in 3 parts to 3 different newspapers, with the instruction that the parts be combined to reveal the killer's identity. It was a substitution cipher. Each symbol in the cipher represented a letter of the alphabet, and the message was encoded by replacing each letter with its corresponding symbol. Substitution ciphers are among the most ancient forms of cryptography, and they have a significant weakness. The frequency distribution of letters in any language is consistent, which means that the most common symbol in a substitution cipher is likely to represent the most common letter in that language. In English, the most common letter is E, followed by T, A, O, I, N, and so on. The Hardens, Donald and Betty, solved Zipher 08 using exactly this approach. They identified the most common symbols, mapped them to the most common English letters, and worked from there, filling in partial words, guessing at likely vocabulary given the known context, and gradually reconstructing the message. The decoded message was disturbing. It expressed a philosophy of murder as slave collection, the idea that the killer was collecting souls for his afterlife, that his victims would be his slaves in paradise, that killing was pleasurable and meaningful in a way that was explicitly framed as spiritual. It ended with a statement that the writer would not give his name because it would slow down his collecting of slaves. The claim that the cipher would reveal his identity was, as noted, false. The decoded message contained no name, no identifying information, nothing that helped investigators understand who had written it. The deception was probably deliberate. The Zodiac had offered the newspapers the prospect of revelation: print my letter or I'll kill, and the cipher will tell you who I am, and then delivered something that satisfied neither promise. It was, in a sense, a demonstration of his control over the situation. He had made the newspapers print his letters, and the revelation he had promised was a lie. Z340 is the cipher that has attracted the most attention, and its 51-year resistance to solution made it something of a legend in the cryptography community. It was sent to the Chronicle in November 1969, 3 months after the first letters. Unlike Zipher 08, it was not a simple substitution cipher. It used a more complex encoding scheme, a homophonic substitution cipher in which each letter could be represented by multiple different symbols, making frequency analysis much more difficult. It also incorporated what cryptographers call a transposition element. The text was not written straight across in rows but in a more complex arrangement that made it harder to identify word boundaries and sentence structure. For 50 years, professional cryptographers, amateur code breakers, and computer scientists with access to increasingly powerful computing resources attempted to solve Z340 and failed. In December 2020, 3 researchers, David Aranchak, a software developer from Virginia, Jarl van Eyck, a Belgian computer programmer, and Sam Blake, an Australian mathematician, announced that they had cracked Z340. Their solution had required a combination of insights. The key breakthrough was the recognition that the cipher used a specific kind of transposition pattern. The text had to be read in a different direction than it appeared, using a specific reading sequence that was not immediately obvious. Once this transposition was understood, the underlying substitution cipher became tractable. The decoded message, when it emerged, was anticlimactic in one sense and chilling in another. It contained a rant about the police, "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me," some statements about the killer's motivations, and a reference to his name being in the Zodiac letters already printed. It contained no name, no identifying information. nothing that helped solve the case. After 51 years, the solved cipher told us what the Zodiac wanted to say. It told us nothing about who he was. The two remaining Zodiac ciphers, Z13 and Z32, are different in character from Z408 and Z340. Z13 is a 13-character cipher that appeared in a letter from November 1969. The letter suggested that the cipher contained the Zodiac's name and invited investigators to use it as evidence. The cipher has never been definitively solved. The most common proposed solution, "My name is AEN," or a similar short phrase, is plausible but unverified. 13 characters is simply not enough text to provide the cryptanalytic traction needed for confident decryption. Z32 appeared in a letter from April 1970, at the bottom of a diagram showing where a bomb had supposedly been planted. The diagram was not useful to investigators, no bomb was found, and the cipher at its bottom, a 32-character sequence, has never been solved. The short ciphers are probably insoluble with current methods, and possibly insoluble in principle, because they are too short to provide enough statistical information for reliable cryptanalysis. If they contain meaningful text at all, and there is no guarantee that they do, we may never know what it is. The Zodiac's use of ciphers was, on one level, a deliberate strategy of mystification. He created puzzles that could not be solved, or that when solved revealed nothing useful, as a way of maintaining the narrative of unknowability. The ciphers were not primarily about communication, they were about performance. They were part of the Zodiac's self-presentation as someone operating above and beyond the capacity of law enforcement and society to comprehend. Beyond the ciphers, the Zodiac letters provided investigators with a substantial body of forensic material. The handwriting was analyzed extensively. Multiple forensic document examiners studied the letters and produced profiles of the writer based on the style, pressure, and form of the writing. The consensus was that the writer was an adult male, probably right-hand, with a level of education consistent with high school or some college, who was deliberately disguising or altering his natural handwriting in some respects. The linguistic analysis of the letters, the vocabulary, the grammatical patterns, the distinctive spellings and phrases, produce similar inferences. The writer appeared to be a native English speaker with average to above-average education. The deliberate misspellings in some letters, a consistent feature across multiple letters, were analyzed as either a genuine reflection of limited literacy, a deliberate disguise, or a pattern with some other significance. DNA analysis became available decades after the crimes, and investigators attempted to extract DNA from the stamps and envelopes of the Zodiac letters. The results were inconclusive. Some letters produced partial profiles, others produced nothing usable, and the profiles obtained were not sufficient to make a definitive identification. The forensic evidence accumulated over 50 years of investigation is substantial but not sufficient. It could, in principle, confirm or exclude a specific suspect. It has not yet produced a name. Several of the Zodiac's letters are particularly well-known and particularly illuminating. The Halloween card, sent to the Chronicle in October 1970, is one of the most striking in the collection. It is an ordinary Halloween card, the kind sold in drugstores, with handwritten additions. The inside cover contains a poem. The outside contains the Zodiac symbol. The combination of commercial banality and personal menace, the ordinary greeting card repurposed as a vehicle for a serial killer's communication, captures something essential about the Zodiac's self-presentation. The letter threatening school children, sent in November 1969, contains the most explicit statement of violent intent in the Zodiac's correspondence. It describes in some detail how an attack on a school bus might be carried out. It was taken seriously enough to prompt significant police response. The attack never happened. The letter sent in March 1971 to the Los Angeles Times is notable for its geographical range. The Zodiac had previously corresponded only with Bay Area newspapers, and for its somewhat different tone, somewhat more measured and less theatrical than many of the earlier letters. And the last confirmed letter, sent to the Chronicle in January 1974, contains a reference to a recent film, The Exorcist, which had been released the previous month, in a way that suggested the writer had recently seen it. This detail is one of the few pieces of evidence in the entire case that allowed investigators to place the Zodiac's timeline in relation to a specific, datable event. One of the primary uses of the Zodiac's extensive handwritten letters was comparison with the handwriting of suspects. Over the decades, dozens of individuals were investigated as potential Zodiacs. Their handwriting was compared with the letters. Most comparisons produced exclusions. The suspect's writing did not match the Zodiac's. A few produced results that were ambiguous or inconclusive. The handwriting comparison that attracted the most attention was that of Arthur Lee Allen, the man who became, over the years, the most prominent and most discussed suspect in the case. Allen's handwriting was compared with the Zodiac's letters on multiple occasions, by multiple document examiners, producing consistently inconclusive results. The document's examiners could neither confirm that Allen wrote the letters nor exclude him as the writer. This ambiguity is typical of the Zodiac case as a whole. Evidence that might be sufficient to focus an investigation does not become sufficient to support a prosecution. The case lives permanently in the space between suspicion and certainty. Z4 08 was solved in a week. Z340 took 51 years. Z13 and Z32 remain closed. Together they tell us what the Zodiac wanted to say. They do not tell us who he was. In Part 3, we go through the suspects, the men whose names have been attached to the case, and what the evidence says about each of them. Rest here. The symbols wait on the page. Some of them mean something. Most of them have been decoded. The name is still not there. The suspects. The Zodiac investigation generated hundreds of suspects over 50 years. Most of them were quickly eliminated, their alibis checked out, their handwriting was inconsistent, their physical descriptions did not match the witnesses. A smaller number survived initial scrutiny and became the subjects of sustained investigation. A handful became famous outside law enforcement circles, names that appear in books and documentaries and online forums, associated with theories and arguments and the persistent hope that if the right person can be identified, the case can finally be called solved. It has not been called solved. No suspect has ever been charged with being the Zodiac Killer. No conviction has ever been obtained. The case remains, officially and in reality, open. I want to go through the most significant suspects carefully, not to sensationalize, not to accuse, but to understand what the evidence actually says and what it does not say. Because the history of the Zodiac investigation includes a great deal of speculation presented as fact, and doing justice to the case requires distinguishing between the two. Arthur Lee Allen is the most prominent suspect in the Zodiac case, and he has been the subject of more sustained investigation than any other individual. Allen was born in 1933 and died in 1992. He was a former school teacher who had lost his teaching credentials after being convicted of child molestation. He was large and heavy-set, physically consistent with the witness descriptions. He had an interest in cryptography and in the kind of violent crime fiction that the Zodiac's letters sometimes resembled. He wore a Zodiac brand watch with a cross and circle symbol on the face, a symbol that the Zodiac used in his letters and on his victims' property. The investigation of Allen was extensive. He was interviewed multiple times by detectives. His house and property were searched on several occasions, in 1972, in 1991. The searches produced no definitive evidence connecting him to the murders. His handwriting was compared with the Zodiac letters and found to be inconclusive. His fingerprints were compared with a partial print from the Paul Stein murder scene and found not to match. DNA obtained from a Zodiac letter was compared with Allen's DNA after his death and also found not to match, though the reliability of the DNA extraction from the letter was disputed. Allen himself consistently denied being the Zodiac. He died of heart failure in 1992, never having been charged. The case against Allen is circumstantial. It rests on the physical description match, the watch, the background in cryptography, and various statements he reportedly made to acquaintances that were suggestive, including, according to some accounts, a statement made before the killings began that he would like to kill people and blame it on someone called Zodiac. This statement, if accurately reported, is startling. But it was reported after Allen had become a suspect, and its provenance is not beyond question. The case against Allen is suggestive. It is not conclusive. And the physical evidence, fingerprints, DNA, points away from him rather than toward him. Lawrence Kane is a suspect who has received less public attention than Allen but who some investigators have considered equally or more compelling. Kane was born in 1924 and died in 2010. He was a former Navy man who had suffered a serious head injury in an automobile accident in the early 1960s, after which his personality reportedly changed significantly. He became, according to those who knew him, more aggressive, more impulsive, more given to sexual predation. The connections between Kane and the Zodiac case are circumstantial but striking. He lived in the areas where the crimes occurred during the relevant periods. His handwriting shows some similarities to the Zodiac letters. His physical description is consistent with the witness accounts. Several of his former acquaintances and victims of his harassment identified him, independently, as someone who frightened them in ways that were consistent with the Zodiac's profile. The most specific connection involves a woman named Donna Lass, who disappeared in 1970 and was proposed as a possible Zodiac victim. Kane had worked at the same hotel where Lass worked, and investigators found evidence that he had tracked her movements before her disappearance. Kane was never charged with anything related to the Zodiac case. The evidence against him, like the evidence against Allen, is circumstantial. Richard Gaikowski is a suspect identified by a researcher named Blaine Blaine, who spent years developing a case that Gaikowski was the Zodiac. Gaikowski was a journalist and filmmaker who worked in the Bay Area during the period of the killings. He is a less well-known suspect than Allen, and the case connecting him to the Zodiac rests primarily on handwriting comparisons and the identification of his voice as the voice of the Zodiac in a recorded phone call. The handwriting comparisons have been assessed differently by different document examiners. Some find them compelling, others do not. The voice identification is based on a comparison between a recording of Gaikowski's voice and a recording of a call from someone claiming to be the Zodiac, made to attorney Melvin Belli in 1969. The comparison is difficult to evaluate objectively because voice analysis of this kind is not a standardized forensic science. Gaikowski died in 2004 and was never investigated by law enforcement as a Zodiac suspect during his lifetime. The Zodiac investigation illustrates, with particular clarity, a problem that afflicts many high-profile unsolved criminal cases: the proliferation of suspects without the means to definitively resolve the question. When a case remains open for 50 years, it accumulates investigators, professional and amateur, each with their own theory, their own suspect, their own reading of the evidence. Each theory has some evidential basis. Each suspect has some connection to the case, however tenuous. Each investigator is convinced, to varying degrees, that they have found the answer. The result is a case that is not simply unsolved but actively contested, a case in which multiple mutually exclusive theories are simultaneously in circulation, each with its advocates, each generating books and documentaries and online discussion. This proliferation of suspects is, in a sense, the Zodiac's greatest achievement. He created a mystery that his own disappearance made permanently irresolvable, and the mystery has continued to generate cultural production and emotional investment long after any reasonable hope of solution has passed. The Zodiac is more present in American culture 50 years after his last letter than most convicted criminals are in the years immediately following their trials. Setting aside the specific suspects and their advocates, what does the available evidence actually support about the Zodiac's identity? The physical descriptions from multiple witnesses are consistent: a white male, heavy-set, medium height, in his late 20s to late 30s at the time of the crimes. This description is broad enough to fit millions of people but narrow enough to exclude most of the population. The forensic evidence, the partial print from the Stein scene, the DNA profiles obtained from some letters, is specific but not yet matched to any identified individual. If a definitive suspect were identified, this evidence could potentially confirm or exclude them. Without a specific candidate, it is not actionable. The linguistic and handwriting evidence suggests a person with average to above average education, familiar with cryptography at an amateur level, with a particular kind of theatrical self-consciousness that manifested in the letter's tone and content. The geographical evidence, the locations of the crimes, the postmarks of the letters, is consistent with someone who lived in or frequently traveled through the Bay Area during the late 1960s. None of this points to a specific person. It describes a category of person that is, unfortunately, large. Why, given the resources devoted to it and the evidence available, was the Zodiac case never solved? Several factors contributed. The crimes were committed in the pre-DNA era, when the forensic tools that now routinely solve murders were not available. The multiple jurisdictions involved, Solano County, Napa County, San Francisco, complicated coordination and created administrative silos that impeded the flow of information. The volume of tips and leads generated by the public and media attention was so large that investigators struggled to evaluate them systematically. But there is also a more fundamental explanation: the Zodiac was lucky, or careful, or both. He did not leave clear evidence at his crime scenes. He communicated by letter rather than in person. He apparently stopped killing, or stopped claiming credit for killings, before investigators had accumulated enough to identify him. And he operated in a period and in a way that made the usual mechanisms of criminal identification less effective. The case may eventually be solved. DNA technology continues to advance. The genealogical DNA databases that have solved other cold cases using distant family matches may eventually yield a Zodiac connection. New documents may emerge. A family member of the Zodiac may come forward. Or the case may never be solved. The Zodiac may have died decades ago, taking the secret with him. His DNA may not be in any database. His family may not know or may not speak. The names are there: Allen, Kane, Gaikowski, and dozens of others less prominent. The evidence does not point conclusively to any of them. In Part 4, we ask what the Zodiac case means for criminal justice, for the psychology of mystery, for the cultural fascination that has kept this unsolved case at the center of American attention for 50 years. Rest here. The letters are in the archive. The name is not in the letters. What was never found? There are cases that get solved. Most murders in the United States, about 60%, by the most recent statistics, are cleared by arrest. The investigative machinery of modern law enforcement, with its DNA databases and surveillance cameras and digital forensics, is remarkably effective at identifying the people who commit the most common kinds of violent crime. And then there are cases that do not get solved. Cold cases. Cases where the evidence was inadequate, or the investigation was flawed, or the perpetrator was simply lucky or careful enough to avoid the mechanisms that catch most killers. These cases accumulate over decades, their files thickening with revisits and new analyses and the occasional renewed publicity that brings in a wave of tips, most of them useless. The Zodiac case is neither a typical solved case nor a typical cold case. It is something stranger, a case that has become, over 50 years, a cultural phenomenon in its own right, a story that has generated more creative and investigative attention than most solved murders, a mystery that the American public has adopted and refused to let go of. The question of what the Zodiac means, why this particular case, why this particular killer, why the fascination has persisted and grown over half a century, is, I think, as interesting as the question of who he was. Before we discuss the cultural phenomenon, we should spend time with the victims. David Faraday was 17 years old. He had plans, school, a future, the ordinary life of a teenager in 1968 California. Betty Lou Jensen was 16. She was shot multiple times while running. She was 16. Darlene Ferrin was 22 years old. She was a waitress. She had a 2-year-old daughter who grew up without her mother. Cecilia Shepard was 22 years old. She was a college student. She died 2 days after the Lake Berryessa attack, never regaining consciousness. Paul Stein was 29 years old. He was a graduate student, driving a cab to support himself while he finished his education. 5 confirmed victims. Possibly more. Each of them a specific person with a specific life, relationships, plans, fears. The cultural phenomenon of the Zodiac, the books, the films, the documentaries, the online forums, the theories, sometimes loses these people in its fascination with the killer. They become background figures in someone else's story, defined by their deaths rather than their lives. This is the particular indignity that high-profile murder cases impose on victims. Their deaths become famous while their lives recede. They deserve to be remembered as more than victims. They deserve to be remembered as people. The Zodiac investigation was not just a case. For many of the people who worked it, it became something closer to an obsession. Detective Dave Toschi of the San Francisco Police Department was the most prominent figure in the investigation during its active phase. Toschi was a skilled and dedicated detective who became, somewhat against his will, a public figure, the detective associated in the press and the public mind with the Zodiac case, the man who was supposed to catch the killer. He worked the case for years, long after most of his colleagues had moved on to other things, and the failure to solve it marked him professionally and personally. Toschi's career was later touched by controversy. There were allegations, never conclusively proven, that he had written a letter to a newspaper himself in an attempt to keep the Zodiac story alive. The allegations damaged his reputation and led to his reassignment. Whether they were true or not, they add another layer of complexity to the already complicated history of the investigation. Other investigators spent significant portions of their careers on the case. Some of them developed strong convictions about the identity of the Zodiac, convictions that the evidence could not fully support but that the years of proximity to the case had made unshakable. The Zodiac. investigation produced, in several of its investigators, the particular combination of insight and tunnel vision that difficult unsolved cases sometimes generate, the ability to see patterns that others miss, alongside the inability to see past those patterns to alternative explanations. The Zodiac Killer entered popular culture with unusual force and has remained there. David Fincher's 2007 film Zodiac, based on a book by Robert Gray Smith, himself a chronicle cartoonist who became obsessed with the case, is one of the most celebrated crime films of its era, praised for its procedural accuracy and its unflinching engagement with the particular frustration of an investigation that never arrives at certainty. The film ends not with a solution but with a kind of provisional identification, the protagonist's personal conviction about the killer's identity, unsupported by evidence sufficient to prove it, that accurately reflects the state of the actual investigation. The case has also generated an enormous online community of amateur investigators. Forums and websites dedicated to the Zodiac investigation have existed since the early days of the Internet. The Z340 Cipher was finally solved by a team that came together through one of these online communities, the Internet enabling the kind of collaborative amateur cryptanalysis that was not possible in the pre-digital era. This online community has produced both genuine insights and significant misinformation. The same digital tools that allowed the Z340 to be cracked have also enabled the proliferation of unfounded theories about the Zodiac's identity, theories that sometimes result in harassment of the families of people who have been publicly named as suspects. The cultural fascination with the Zodiac is real and sustained. It is also, in some respects, troubling. The fascination with the killer, at the expense of the victims, is a consistent feature of true crime culture that the Zodiac case exemplifies in an especially pure form. Why does the Zodiac case exert such fascination? Part of the answer is the ciphers. Codes and puzzles are inherently engaging. They offer the prospect of a definitive solution, a moment at which the answer becomes known. The Zodiac's ciphers promise to reveal his identity, and the promise, even though it was broken, created a relationship between the audience and the case that feels like it should be resolved. Part of the answer is the letters themselves. The Zodiac was an unusually expressive criminal. He communicated extensively, he expressed a philosophy, he had a voice. This voice is disturbing and compelling in equal measure. It is the voice of someone who wanted to be known, who was frustrated by his anonymity, who created the public persona of the Zodiac precisely because he wanted an audience. The audience he created has outlasted him. And part of the answer is the fundamental human discomfort with unresolved questions. We want to know who the Zodiac was. The desire is not just intellectual, it is moral. The victims deserve justice. The families deserve answers. The community deserves to know. The case's failure to arrive at resolution is a failure of the justice system, a reminder that not every crime is punished, not every question is answered. The Zodiac thrives on this discomfort. The mystery is, in a sense, his final communication, the last letter he sent, the one that will never be answered. In recent years, a new investigative tool has produced results in other cold cases that offer some hope for the Zodiac investigation. Genealogical DNA analysis, the technique used to identify the Golden State Killer in 2018, works by comparing DNA from a crime scene with DNA in public genealogical databases, identifying distant relatives of the unknown perpetrator, and then building family trees to narrow down the identity of the suspect. The technique requires both a good DNA sample from the crime scene and a sufficiently populated database to find matching relatives. The Zodiac case has both problems and prospects on this front. The DNA extracted from the Zodiac letters is partial and of uncertain quality. The extraction process damages the DNA, and it is not clear that the profiles obtained are reliable enough for genealogical comparison. The question of whether the DNA on the letters represents the Zodiac's DNA at all, rather than DNA from postal workers, investigators, or others who handled the letters, is also not fully resolved. But the genealogical DNA technique is improving, and the databases are growing. Cases that seemed permanently closed have been solved by this method. It is possible, not certain, but possible, that the Zodiac case will eventually yield to this approach. If it does, the result will not necessarily be satisfying. The Zodiac is almost certainly dead. An identification 50 years after the crimes would provide answers but not justice in any conventional sense. It would give the victims' families closure, if they are still alive. It would close the case file. It would end one of the longest-running mysteries in American criminal history. It would not bring anyone back. The letters are in the archive. The ciphers are partly solved. The suspects are named but not proven. The victims are remembered, imperfectly, through the fame of the case that took their lives. The investigators are retired or dead, their notes in boxes, their convictions unconfirmed. The Zodiac, whoever he was, wherever he went, however and whenever he died, achieved what he seemed to want. He became famous. He became, as he put it in one of his letters, the most dangerous animal of all. He outlasted the investigation. He outlasted most of the people who investigated him. He outlasted, probably, his own body. What he did not outlast is the question. The question is still alive. It is more alive, in some ways, than it has ever been. More people are aware of the case, more resources are available to investigate it, more technology is applicable to the evidence than at any point in the case's history. The question may yet be answered. Or it may not. Either way, 5 people are dead who should not be dead. 7, or 13, or 37, we do not know the number. We know the names of 5. 5 names that deserve to be said, and remembered, and separated from the fame of the case that surrounds them. David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Dolene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, Paul Stein. Not victims. People. The letters are in the archive. The name is not there. Good night.